Hey, ulcerative colitis in my 40s. Sleep deprived here. I hope you guys have missed me because I missed you. The stunning silence in the comment section is just something that I always yearn for in the last 2 months. And I'm sorry it's been 2 months instead of one, but it took me another month to just come up with an episode. So here it is, episode 101. And I just want to set the record straight and sort of manage expectations because this is a call with HR, of course it is. Um, this is sort of only a fancy book report, and I'm going to tell you the books in the beginning of every episode that we've reviewed so that you can go and write them down and sort of read on your own. And that's the entire object of it, that if you haven't, then you know the gist of it. If you do want to go ahead and read more about it, you're most welcome. It's an encouragement to do that. This does not nearly summarize everything in these books. For this episode, we've primarily read from Albert Camus' The Rebel, Like a Thief in Broad Daylight by Slavoj Zizek, the entire collection of Emma Goldman, On Anarchism, Notes on Anarchism by Noam Chomsky, and The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoire. Books that have been tangentially referred to in this episode are The Parable of the Madman. Actually, The Parable of the Madman is within a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche, and The Inglorious Empire by Shashi Tharoor, along with Animal Farm by George Orwell. All of these books were read in an attempt to understand rebellion as a concept in philosophy, and this is the result. So I'm just gonna cue the fucking... While I was articulating this episode, the book I was reading is called Like a Thief in Broad Daylight by Slavoj Zizek. For those of you who don't know, he's a professor of philosophy and a very vocal anti-capitalist philosopher working today. And the man is something of a meme by himself. And when he's not writing, academic works that are slightly transphobic, he is genuinely making some good points about how ideology co-opts and consumes everything. And rebellion as an activity is sort of made impossible because of that. But I thought this is not the best book to make that point. I've read that message before, just articulated by a different person and in the context of history. The book I'm talking about is The Rebel by Albert Camus. Albert Camus is an author that has not come up the first time on this podcast. I'm actually surprised that he doesn't come up every episode, but heck. But these books are not identical in any sort of way. I genuinely believe Albert Camus is way better at structuring his thoughts when he writes down than Slavoj Zizek. At least this is the only book I've read by him. So I'm gonna assume this is not all of his work. I did watch Pervert's Guide to Ideology and Pervert's Guide to Cinema, both of which actually I found to be very articulate and very well structured. But I think that's because somebody else was directing and he was just providing the content, which in itself is a different medium. And I think the medium was used well. We're not here to talk about Pervert's Guide to Ideology or Pervert's Guide to Cinema. We're here to talk about rebellion. And as the episode progresses, I hope to be a little more articulate about how these two books are different from each other. But the point of the books that we are taking up is that the praxis of rebellion is what sells it to the existing institutions or mimics them. So, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. I can't fucking believe I did that. But it illustrates my point in some amount, is what I'm trying to tell you. At some point, rebellion just becomes about the ends and not the means, which is what kills it in terms of the longer context of history. And we'll explore exactly why, in just a second. But before we explore that, I do need to let you know that I went down this rabbit hole because when I found out that the praxis of rebellion is what sells it to the existing institutions and, whatever mimics them, a younger version of me sort of felt attacked. The reason for that is pretty simple. Google would know this better than anyone else, is that when I was growing up, the rebel was, or even is, a very romanticized personality archetype to have. Back then, it was Green Day, a sound of traditional suburban punk rock that sounded angry. I heard their music when I was 12, did not understand most of the political context in American Idiot till I was 15, and grew out of it at an embarrassingly late age of 20. Part of the reason why I grew out of Green Day's music is also the reason why this episode is being made, because I realized that rebellion can just as well be sold as any other commodity to be rendered completely harmless to profit the powers that actually make you angry. And the second one, of course, about the fact that while a lot of rebellion is pronouncement of your individuality, that's not the end of the line for what popular, or as the cool kids would call it, based rebellion is. And by the way, when I give the Green Day example, I don't mean to villainize the band completely. I do know that it is a victory in itself that a company as big as Warner Brothers would give a platform to an artist who's extremely vocal about the things that they're vocal about. I think it opened a gateway to cultural liberalism, which I kind of like. It means the companies were on the side of political dissent, or were at least normalizing political dissent, definitely not having a problem with monetizing political dissent, which in itself is a victory, I assume. So, by the way, while I was writing this episode, I knew it was going to be excruciatingly long because I made some claims here which are preposterous and in some ways claim enlightenment, which is not the intention of this episode. I don't intend to have opinions involved in this episode. Who the fuck am I kidding? Of course, I'll have opinions about this episode or in this episode, but they will be opinions in context of literature. Most of this episode, as I've said in the intro, is about literature review, a very fancy book report, basically. But it is a very excruciatingly long book report. So I understand if you TLDR this episode, but here we go. Oh, also, for a change, this entire series has been recorded in parts, which are supposed to work together. And this is part one. Part one, of course, is what is rebellion, because I like my etymology kids. It's usually a shorter segment, but, well, I thought, why not go all out? Anyway, the Merriam-Webster dictionary would define rebellion as opposition to authority or dominance. Not a bad place to start at all. Rebellion in itself is tied to the psychological concept and sociological need of conformity, and at least in the anthropogenic context in which we will be exploring the concept, there is not exactly an existence of the same divorced from it. If there are people listening who've heard the older episodes, I would assume you remember the conformity episode. It was episode 98 if I'm not wrong. And I hope you pardon my repetition for about 5 minutes about some of the things that I will be saying in this chapter, but it is important for us to sort of comprehensively get forward with it. I talk as if I'm an actual school teacher. I really apologize for that tone. But conformity, of course, is a social construct that demands homogeneity of behavior, or do as thy neighbor does behavior. If you think very hard about it, the notion of crime is derived from conformity, and it runs our everyday lives. Everyone chooses to behave in a way that doesn't violently maim or kill another person, and lack of conformity with those choices is aggressively or severely penalized, because that's what the social contract is. That, hey, both of us can be neighbors, I will farm and you can process that food and sell it to somebody else, but let's not kill each other because we're in this space and that's what we agreed on. The existence of rebellion by virtue of this arrangement hence comes from a very simple cognitive space. The society or the people who act on behalf of the same are wrong to proclaim what they are saying. In Camus' book I was talking about, that sounds like I said Camus, but that's okay. I'm normalizing it. I am ruining Albert Camus' name in English as a Maharashtrian. And I hope everybody who speaks even a little bit of French is fine with that. So in Camus' book that I was talking about, he defines rebellion through an illustration of a master-slave relationship. The most comfortable one, as we would assume. sorry, not worth it. A rebel is born when the slave refuses to conform to the task or fate imposed upon him by his master. Now, the interpretation that plays out is that master now, to secure his power, must villainize the rebel, painting himself as a caretaker and paint the rebel as a megalomaniac who wants to replace the master. the story arc we will explore through this episode. But Camus' understanding of rebellion, at least the one he preaches to practice in the book, is that of Prometheus. In the section where he's talking about metaphysical rebellion, where the rebel not only denounces the command of his master, but also treats his master, may that even be God in the case of Prometheus, to be an equal. And rebellion lies in expression of disagreement, not an enforcement of will. An achievement of will is, of course, achieving synchronization with your words, but rebellion by itself is only the act of saying no. No, you will not treat me this way. No, this is not an acceptable amount of money for this work. No, this is not an acceptable command to give given our relationship, our things that is sort of he's illustrating with. But when it comes to rebellion lying in the expression of disagreement and not in the enforcement of the will of the rebel, is something that Zizek says in his book loosely as well. That rebellion in congruence with ideology is what the current structures of acquiring conformity use to diffuse or isolate any form of rebellion. He explains this sentiment through platforms that Hillary Clinton or Macron ran on, or even for that matter, Marine Le Pen ran on, or Donald Trump. Slavoj Zizek asserts his position that in the context of the elections in the 2010s, the major running platform for any democracy was not that you should vote for us because we're good people, that you should vote for us because the other party is too bad for you. There's no space for you there. So we're the last option remaining for you. And I would agree with Zizek in the sense that it is death of rebellion, in the sense that practicing it becomes extremely difficult without giving into an ideological stalemate, where idealism by itself is not the sale anymore. I mean, to me, all that it means is that politically there's no representation for you if you're rebelling. You can't politically affiliate yourself with a cause anymore, is sort of what Zizek says, but we'll sort of explore how that's the case throughout history. But I would be a dum-dum to talk about rebellion only in the political context, which is why I've sort of divided up the discussion about rebellion across three headings, which is cultural or individualistic rebellion, something we will deal with first before we walk into, political rebellion as it exists today, or political rebellion in the context of history, and then the dissonance between rebellion and revolution in the context of history as well. For part 2 of this episode, which starts from this point onwards, we're talking about cultural rebellion or individualistic rebellion. And almost everything I have said during this section of the episode was learned by me in a conversation with Isha Pangalia. If you don't know who that is, like if you're new to the podcast, or even if you're old to the podcast and not heard the episodes where I've tangentially referred her work or her presence in my life, she's a filmmaker and I do like one of her films. I'll leave a link down in the description if you want to go check it out. I don't think she listens to the podcast, but if you do, let me know, let's hang out, please. Sorry, not the point of this episode. She said something that stuck with me for the most of my life. I think I was about 20 when I heard this from her. Rebellion doesn't have to be such a presentation. Rebellion is usually an expression or choice in lifestyle. Something that simple is also rebellious. Like Camus stated in the uncomfortable example of master-slave relationship as the origin of rebellion, I don't think it's a hard thing to figure out that rebellion exists within context of a power dynamic and always starts in the protection of individuality. In the sense that it's something that you would do just out of common sense. And there would be barriers about it. For example, the example I'm about to give you is sort of from this documentary called India Untouched. I think it's a 5-part documentary about a gentleman tracing untouchability and casteism across the country. And I think the documentary was made around the year 2010. So until that time, the way caste hierarchy sort of implemented itself is that upper caste people and lower caste people had different places of worship and different places of drawing water from wells. This is particularly an example from a village in Gujarat where the school kids are segregated as the higher caste kids and the lower caste kids, and then the untouchable kids. And they all live those lives segregated altogether. So rebellion in that context is of course bringing them together in the same class, or even for lower caste people to drink from the well made for higher caste people. I know there was slight escalation there, but I think it's an escalation that illustrates point very well. Rebellion is really something that simple. Drinking water in a place that's not designated for you to drink, especially when it's reasonable for you to drink there. And I think that example sort of segues into how this is an amazing experience of how these isolated incidents of oppression of identity become a collective experience for most people within a group, and with helplessness and identity with an oppressive force, an identity of an oppressive force, rebellion turns into a political stance. Hence, rebellion at an elemental level is an expression of individuality that society or powers that govern the society do not agree with, for reasons they do or do not understand or stand by. By that, I mean, depending where you are and when you are, you could even mean that being left-handed is an act of rebellion. Somewhere in the 1450s, when witch hunting had become an established activity of the Scottish townfolk, one of the ways they identified a witch or a sorcerer was if the man was left-handed, or a woman was left-handed. Even in Salem, witch hunters used to carry the myths that devil's descendants conducted the devil's business with left hands. That's a telltale sign. And of course, these are peasants who were never educated who would do such a thing, but they were never stopped by authorities of the time. So around the 1750s, European culture hits something called the enlightenment, and it's no longer woke to keep burning people alive, even though it's a practice that's not punished, but it's a heavily discouraged one by a lot of the cultures. So one of the ways you could piss everybody off at the dinner table in the 1750s was by eating with your left hand. Actually, you can do that at my home, because Indian cultures actually believe that you wash your poop with your left hand, because like we don't have toilet paper. I don't know if people know this. We use something called jets, and even in places where we don't have jets, we use a bucket and a mug. So there's a very huge taboo about eating with your left hand, because you're not supposed to eat with the same hand you clean your poop, as if you're not going to do other things and then touch your face with your left hand. But this is sort of like a example that was used by teenagers to scandalize their grandparents. It's a relatively harmless example. Of course, people died, but the context of rebellion in it is only in like 1750s. I believe it's not difficult to imagine for all of you an example of how an expression of yourself would be a conflict in society. But the Captain Obvious tone of this episode doesn't exactly stop me from going in the direction of explaining it further. I kind of have to actually at this point. I've committed way too much to it. Anyway, the author I'm choosing to illustrate further in this section is Simone de Beauvoir. And the book I'm talking about mostly is The Second Sex. I intend to borrow a very specific articulation from the book that I found very interesting. It's something that she spends most of the book justifying very, very clearly as to what it exists. It's called the othering. Most people who have studied gender studies or any allied subjects with gender studies such as feminist jurisprudence in their academics might have heard this, or even just people who've been reading feminist literature to actually understand what it is. And of all the books that I'm referring in this episode, this is the one I kind of urge you to read in its entirety. It's a pretty excruciatingly long book, but it's a book worth your time. If you can read nonfiction, I definitely recommend you read this first. It's because it's kind of like life-changing when it comes to the questions it asks in the contemporary social culture. I think it's ignorant not to read this book, in my honest opinion. I'm just putting it out there. It's available in print, on Kindle, and on Audible. Get it done. For those of you who don't know the name, she's known mostly to have made one of the biggest literary contributions to feminist thought as it exists today, which is the book I'm talking about. Coming back to the concept we're borrowing from the book, is called the othering. Simone de Beauvoir makes the point that society in its years of evolution has oriented itself to put a man, a male, at the center of exploration of individuality, and all other social gender roles are weaved to serve the purpose of a man. For example, the female right to vote was not recognized until the 1800s in Britain. Women's right to possess property after marriage was not recognized in India till 1899. And Section 375 does not recognize the rape of a married woman by her husband above the age of 16 in India till this date. But these are symptoms of the othering. The othering by itself means that biologically born males that inherit the triads of traditional masculinity or masculinity as it's allied by itself are born to inherit the leadership roles in society, or even possess the autonomy to do things that can be eccentric, like an artist or a writer. All men who deviate from this part are a shame to society by proximity, which is why a feminine man is a shame to his family, his village, and then to the world by extension, in the context of the othering when it's talking about a developing society. Women in the power dynamic are the secondary sex altogether. That's how a patriarchy functions according to the othering. A sex that only exists to serve and aid the development and exploration of individuality for men. And by femininity as a cultural identity is an acceptance of subservience in patriarchal structures, which means that even feminine men are to be subserved and brought under control. For those of you who grew up in Indian households such as myself, you can see this clearly in your own house. It shows itself very well. Othering is the reason why when your dad can cook, that's a perk, that's an advantage, that's something that's good for him. But if your mom can't cook, that's a criteria of a good woman. It's an actual thing that most Indian households grew up with. It's something I have seen myself being talked about very openly by people. By the way, I'm just letting you guys know this is a gross oversimplification of the concept of othering. When Simone de Beauvoir explains it, it's a lot more nuanced. But this summary of the concept helps me push what I am trying to convey. When society forms itself in a way that you're on the sides, to say that that doesn't apply to me is also rebellion. The choice to act as one feels fit to express themselves even within the bounds of reason and consequences to others can help be an act of rebellion. Feminism, for example, is a wing of activism and philosophy constantly associated with rebellion, and is most widely in conversation in the last 50 years in culture across free countries. Most of it is not only to demand power, autonomy, representation, and protection from violence, as had been promised already by free societies, but also fairly individualistic things like dressing how one wants or sharing accommodation with person of the opposite sex. An actual problem in most Indian cities, by the way, marrying outside caste or religion, etc. Things that have nothing to do with other people at all. And to be honest, when it comes to othering and feminism, I'm pretty sure you're aware of the debate more than I am, and I know this is supremely generic stuff that I'm putting out there, but there is a huge academic dedicated lists of literature when it comes to justifying the position of women in society. Of course, the claim of these studies would be that women ended up in these places and actual social barriers were not put up, or even if they were, they had very little role to play part in it. But if they are a result of a natural placement that way, there's still barriers that are present. So they reinforced themselves as discriminations, which is how oppression perpetuates when it comes to denying people the right to individuality that way. And when it comes to cultural rebellion, it brings me something that is close to me, which is comedy, and more specifically insult comedy. And this is something I've discussed previously in my video about insult memes, that insult and ridicule are a way to direct socially acceptable behavior. Like, think of an insult as a positive punishment for a behavior somebody did not like, which is why everything from a threat of violence to regular insults against people who dare and deviate from the normative or traditional archetype of a man or a woman are acts in social engineering in some ways, especially when you do them to strangers, to discourage those things. When you do them to your friends, of course, it's an expression of endearment in some ways, because my friends insult me because I exist. There's no other reason for why they insult me, and in that case, their proximity to me sort of helps. The explanation is the context of their proximity in my life. But in the absence of that proximity, I believe things change suddenly, because an insult from a stranger is usually about the thing that they're insulting about you, and not about who they are to you. Which is why men in booty shorts or women in corporate offices are threats to the patriarchal order that in that sense get discouraged by shit like this. And hence their will and existence in that way in those spaces is rebellion in its most elemental form, which is how individualistically rebellion manifests itself. Since I painted myself in a corner where I defined rebellion as anything that society or powers of society can disagree with, I don't think I could give you an exhaustive list of all the acts of rebellion you could probably do against society or against a particular facet of society. But I'm certain you get the point that elemental rebellion is basically an act done by an individual in the proclamation of individuality and blah 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 blah. And so I think we should move on to part 3 of this episode, which is talking specifically about political rebellion. We discussed in the introduction and to some extent how political rebellion most often stems from a shared experience of oppression. But the problem with political rebellion is that agitation by itself is only diagnosis of a problem, and to some extent like retaliation against it. In the long run, the rebellion only gains disagreement but not sustenance of a functional way of living from disagreement. If there is a lesson that I have learned from reading existentialist philosophy, not to say that I have read a significant amount of it, but the worst part of existence in general in that's described in the philosophy is that it's made absurd by the logistical nightmare of being alive that we inherit with birth. Besides the gathering of resources and being wired to want other people so that you can facilitate resources efficiently for them and then seek meaning in romantic relationships because it furthers your generations, is quite a lot for a dude who was just born, randomly. As Captain Obvious would have us know, the reason power distributes itself within society is also to procure resources for this logistical nightmare. And one of the ways Walter Kaufman's book, which I recommend as a good starting point for people trying to read existential philosophy long term, because it's quite good in the sense that it commentates on everything and gives you a background of these people who are writing. Anyway, the book sort of says that the entire school is sort of a rebellion in the sense that the direction of questioning is in the direction of why. Why is it good to conform to society? Why is it noble to have a sense of identity with the society you had no choice picking to be born in? Why must we accept a sense of purpose? And etc. And of course, followed by autonomy of the individual being the conclusion of most of these questions, in the sense that the absurd exists in difference to human existence. As a person to live by consequences of the things he chooses to do, with no gods, peers, or state being the ultimate authority to keep in check or to approve or disapprove of. Which is why you will find existential philosophers to be involved in resistance or rebellious efforts across the board. We've discussed Simone de Beauvoir's literature as a ground of how gender was related to rebellion. Sartre was involved in some serious anti-bourgeois politics of his time, publicly appearing with or in praise of Castro and Che Guevara, who led the Cuban revolution. An endorsement we will discuss in detail just in a bit. And Albert Camus, who was a sympathizer and contributed in the capacity of a journalist to the resistance movement for decolonization of Algeria by France. Camus himself was a French Algerian in the sense that he was a Frenchman born in Algeria and was grouped by a lot of revolutionary groups to be parts of Algeria to be removed with the French colonization. But he believed he had integrated himself there by virtue of his birth. But all of them kept a significant distance between them and their political affiliations because of something Camus talks about in his book about the absolute enemy in the context of discussing rebellion: messianism. The word indicates the tendency of people who organize political rebellions to paint themselves with purpose as liberators or saviors in the context of the cause they rebel for. Albert Camus asserts that messianism is the root of most decay of any noble idea on its way to a practical application. The way the dude practiced atheism also asserted the same notion for its time. He did not believe that religious people to be inherently evil, but definitely proclaimed that their endorsement of violence in the name of God made them worse people than they believed themselves to be. His notion is same as Nietzsche in the parable of the madman. Actually, it's a direct quote in the book as well. It's something that he talks in reference of within the book in this section. It's something that we've discussed in episode 7, and I'm not going to repeat the entire parable again, but I think you should go listen to it. Is that when he says God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him, God is sort of a surrogate for idealism in the story. And when he calls the church the tomb of God, he means that the establishment of the church is the use of the ideal of God as a puppet for the purposes of the church, for the purposes of extracting power from the ideal and nothing else. And to be honest, it's not a hard example to follow in the context of rebellion against monarchy. Not to be controversial, but to be controversial, I do think our political reality today is a little better than the past. And by the past, I mean the times of aristocrats and monarchies and all these things. I know things are pretty bad, and it is quite sad and scary that religion-based hostility has survived all these years, and our democratic institutions get bent pretty easily to very non-secular ideas sometimes. But there's no room to discuss actual policy today. We'll do that someday when I feel like I have a proper death fish. Anyway, the reason I say monarchy is because the rebellion against the institution of monarchy in today's world is the easiest to support, according to me. I think no matter how strong your faith in God is, to suggest that God appointed a lineage of people to only rule and a lineage of people to only do the hard labor with no benefits is a tad bit offensive. Even when you profit off of it, I think it's a little offensive. Besides the kingdom of Attila the Hun, somewhere around 480, no monarchies that I know have existed without the gods being the endorsing or appointing powers of the monarch. Just editor's note that Tengrism as a religion may have been popular or majoritarian at this time, but monarch declared himself to be God as a hand of God, which is its own flavor of problems for me. The point is, power concentrates in societies, especially when things are desperate, because the notion is that quick acting groups will have room to tackle the problem and shift strategies if needed. When these concentrated power structures need justifications, they come up with institutions like monarchy, where the gods have chosen who gets to rule and who gets to serve and who gets to die for whom. And I think when it comes to Nietzsche's story, this is the best example. I'm pretty sure that no matter whose gods are real, none of the gods actually appointed a monarch for different places, or they would not be as easily replaceable. It almost seems to me, if I pay very keen attention, that this idea of a perfect man who was sent by God to save us has been used to sort of perpetuate power. But that's you decide that. All the historians agree, but that's a different story. So institutions like monarchies or oligarchies or aristocracies, the last two are a little different than monarchies. It's where accumulation of wealth, which is something we deal with in the next episode, wink wink, where customs like inheritance dictate what must be done. The different story, different time, we'll talk about it. These institutions only came to be challenged in the rebellions during the era of enlightenment. And every philosopher we name dropped in this episode happens to think that that's where human civilization shat the metaphorical bed in the name of rebellion. And it's something we'll discuss further on. I know technically we've discussed zero political rebellions, which is why I made entire part 4 about the examples of political rebellions into revolutions. And the reason I've chosen monarchy as the main opponent against which these rebellions are being placed is because monarchy is an easy institution to locate. It's an easy institution to hate as well as of today in the context of the rebellions that we're studying. and things are slightly more black and white. And even in those cases, things are fairly complicated right now. So the illustration that we're going with is large enough tangentially to move into what we need to talk about: the progression of a popular rebellion into political action. And a revolution often where the spirit of rebellion goes to die, at least according to everyone that we've read so far. I think one of the most quoted things I hear in barroom debates or even Discord chats is like Zizek saying a failed rebellion is what lapses the state into authoritarianism. A statement I categorically disagree with, even though it's seen to be true in all the examples we will take immediately after this. But I believe that economic anxiety is what pushes people into authoritarianism the fastest. But my disagreement is with the notion that this statement is used to protect the status quo. By saying that authoritarianism will increase if we try to erase it, instead let it persist in the amount that it exists, not with the tendency observed around history. So, Camus talks about something similar, but in terms of critique of praxis of revolutions, where he diagnoses the death of the spirit of the rebellion, the moment revolutionary movements grow from spontaneous crowds of disagreements to calculated institutional organs that justify the means by the ends. The emphasis more on the fact that justifications of unfavorable means is present more than the organization itself. That's the point that he is trying to make, at least in this book that I read. The primary example I have chosen to take for this is that of the French Revolution. The book that I read was Hero of Two Words by Mike Duncan, and also I heard his series on the French Revolution on Revolutions, the podcast. If my obnoxiously summarized history lesson of the French Revolution annoys you, please go check out his stuff. He does a wonderful job. It's comprehensive and really well explained. If you want something a lot more summarized but not as summarized as I am doing it, go over to Oversimplified History. It has a great 2-part video as a channel that's a lot shorter but does a good job on explaining the revolution by itself in the context of a sequence of events. Getting to the point I'm trying to make with the example of French Revolution, this is how it started and this is how it ended. So I'm going to tell you the whole story. The revolution started with agitation in the city circles of Paris, where a very weak and very poorly perceived King Louis XVI is still enabling a class system that exploits the poor and masquerading it to be a fair and represented government. All of this is after he helped the American Revolution out of spite for the British for losing the 7 Years' War in the North American colonies. Remember that his help of the Americans in the struggle for liberation, or #Brexit, was done with no treaties for any reimbursement for his contributions that were promissory in terms. So just so you understand, France is pretty broke. But Louis doesn't want to stop partying. And unlike his father, he doesn't want to govern either. And this is very important because the French culture at this point, especially the nobility and the monarchy, enjoys a lot of lavish parties. They're actually known for their celebrations at this point in history. So while Louis XVI doesn't want to govern, he gets something called the Estates General after 170 years to assist him in governing. A move that takes governing duties off him, but not responsibilities, because he's still the executioner of the will of God in the terms of the French political context. This assembly was made of 3 wings: the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else, which is the peasants. The first 2 were, of course, the party crowd, the one that paid none of the taxes and had all the French parties the French were popular for at the time. And the last one paid all of the taxes and did all of the work. The reason for this was very simple, because 3% of the population represented by the clergy and nearly 10% of the population represented by the nobility, or even less, had 2 votes each, and the remaining 1 vote went to the general estate. Naturally, all laws passed were rigged to be only favorable to the first 2 states. So when the economy of the country fell and the government started going broke, The solution was very simple in front of both the nobility and the clergy, because they didn't want to sacrifice on any of their, I want to use the word, luxuries. And so they taxed the peasants to the teeth. Like, peasants, farmers, and merchants were supposed to maintain their lavish ways even when the 1780s wars, harsh weathers, and famines were running the state into bankruptcy. So, naturally, in 1789, the Third Estate organized themselves into a national assembly as a parallel government in France in open defiance of the king. Officially, as of 20th June of the year, they had taken the tennis court oath and declared that themselves as a parallel government on France. On 14th July 1789, overlooking the fact that the capital was surrounded by the French Royal Army, because at this point the king had started getting scared of his city, the people of Paris decided to arm themselves in anticipation of a violent suppression. And the National Assembly saw the opportunity and declared and formed the National Guard as opposed to the French Guard. Basically, there were two armies as well. A parallel army was created by the National Assembly. The reason the date is popular today, however, is because of how the people of Paris chose to arm themselves on this date. First, by storming a military hospital where they got the guns but no gunpowder, and then storming a royal prison called Bastille. Here's where the revolution got difficult to back as well, by the way. So, it's true that Bastille was a symbol of oppression in this city at this very point in time, and the reason it was stormed was also because of culturally what it held at the time. But this is where the revolution got really difficult to back, because the angry people gathered to storm the prison not only stormed the prison to get the gunpowder, but also killed the governor, his guard, and put the governor's head on a pike. A move that National Assembly endorsed and reinforced immediately. Of course, this was the time when edgy writers get their due, because Jean-Paul Marat, a writer who never left his bathtub because of his skin condition, was writing violent fantasies about the nobility and the royalty. Like, lot of head-on pike action throughout these fantasies. And angry people would do these under the complete endorsement of the National Assembly, and then were done by the National Convention as of September 22, 1792, which was an official declaration of the First French Republic. What consequently began after that and that lasted till 1799 is often referred to as the Reign of Terror, where Robespierre, the figurehead of the revolution and the leader of the National Convention at this point, cut off about 40,000 heads a year at his peak for not respecting reason or even remembering the days of the French monarchy as better days. With the war declared by all panicking monarchies that surrounded France, all the churches were also turned into temples of reason, because the church reminded people too much of the monarchy. At the end, the monarch did derive his entire power from God. And hence, in the Reign of Terror, it is considered by everyone that we know that while France did become a republic at the end of the revolution for about 10 years, those 10 years were horrible because the masters were replaced by people who saw themselves as slaves to just enact the same power dynamic. They ruled like the monarchy. And of course, all of this ultimately ended in a military dictatorship by Napoleon, which launched them into a series of wars with the ambition of conquering all of Europe. But don't get me wrong, the French Revolution is still one of the most important events in modern history. The reason being because this was the first time that somebody said hashtag normalize not having a king. And this was a mainstream example of that. There was articulation done during this time that to this day forms what we call democratic principles, the Declaration of Human Rights, and so on and so forth. But when Robespierre, the National Convention led by the Jacobin Party, sort of started leaning in the direction of seeing themselves as liberators and saviors of the people, they gave into the idea of messianism that monarchy is based on, and which is why the revolution failed. Another similar example that we'll be dealing from Europe is what happened in 1917's October Revolution in Russia, where oppressive Tsarist regime of Nicholas II that actually sent undertrained, underfed soldiers in blistering cold to be fed as fodder to bullets and bayonets, so that the soldiers that ran behind them as they were being bayoneted and shot in the face could take the guns from the people behind the enemy lines, was replaced by a provincial democratic government, which in turn was taken over by the Bolsheviks during a military coup of the said government. The point I'm trying to make is that there is no controversy about the fact that the Tsarist Russia was pretty fucking horrible. I think these are events from the Battle of Manzikert in 1914 or 1915 as such, where the Russian army had actually run out of ammunition to provide to their soldiers. So the actual instructions where the front line goes dies at the bayonets, the guns, and then the guns are procured on the front line at the cost of the death of that many soldiers. So you can imagine that people weren't exactly happy. So as of February 1917, the monarchy was toast. A democracy was put in its place with like king as a titular head, but it was of course burdened with corruption. It wasn't the most effective, and to make things worse, it did launch an extremely failed attack against the Germans on the front lines, which again was even more unpopular than before. But when Lenin returned from exile in Switzerland, he did not do much differently when it comes to treating the people of Russia to justify securing power in these volatile times. I think it's not a controversial statement to say that the peasants were the champions of the communist cause at this time, but in the Tambov rebellions, the Leninist government decided to use poison gas against the peasants that were the champions of their own political ideology. Of course, Lenin was a modest man who died an untimely death after the violent crushing of political opponents and peasant rebellions. But the absolute power was inherited after that with Stalin that captured the party. And the revolution failed its rebellious cause nonetheless. It just brought about a very industrial scale at which this dictatorship could now function. If the two events in history that I described in the last part sort of don't do enough to describe what messianism is and how it ruins revolutions, it is illustrated very well in two of the books by George Orwell that it inspired, Animal Farm and 1984. Animal Farm is a pretty bare bones and pretty shameless appropriation of this historical event of French Revolution into an Orwellian dystopia. To be honest, very well done and very masterfully crafted when it comes to its execution. And 1984 is, of course, an exploration of the terrain of what totalitarianism would look like culturally, architecturally, and, economically, whatever. And it's very nice to have found congruence between these ideas that when the means are justified by the ends are worthless by that time if rebellion is your prerogative. In spirit, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution are two of the most important events in history in the sense that worker culture was not the same. Fear by itself changed our political structures in ways that accommodates for our concerns because of these historical events as well. Democracies are born from the same idea, and it's not like revolutions are always plagued with the same parts. Which is why part 5 of this episode deals with revolution where messianism was not a primary problem. I mean, given the picture that was painted to me by these two books that I was initially talking about in the beginning of the episode, which is Like a Thief in Broad Daylight and The Rebel by Albert Camus, very few times in history do we get to see rebellion ever succeed in achieving its philosophical goal to abolish power disparity and achieve equality. At least in the way I see Camus talking about it. And to be honest, in nearly the 100 pages of him talking about political rebellion, I could not spot a ray of sunshine where rebellion ended in ways that did not reflect death, destruction, and overall relapse into authoritative or what some may refer to as barbaric ways. My primary instinct to look for a revolution that did not deify itself was to try and look for a revolution where the end result was not a state. And I found one in Noam Chomsky's Notes on Anarchism. Noam Chomsky is one of the greatest thinkers of our time, and the man has proclaimed himself to be, at least at heart, an anarchist, but understands the fragile nature of it in the modern geopolitical context as well, and refers to it as his naive vision of a utopian future. However, he does claim in his book that anarchism, unlike any other 20th century ideology, is a lens of criticism that is most relentlessly extensive in its scope, which is why he takes it seriously. This book, however, felt like Chomsky was settling a score with a historian over a very specific historical event, that of the history of the Spanish Civil War, which is a great segue because we just talked about Orwell. To most of the people who studied history in SSC board of Maharashtra like me, the Spanish Civil War was a paragraph in the 8th grade. And more than anyone, this is an important history lesson for me, and I will try to keep it brief so that we don't get lost in the details of it or the excitement that I have about it. The Civil War in Spain was a very fitting prequel for all of us because it was like a prequel to World War II history. The 19th century was not the best time for Spain. They were scoring massive L's on all sides, and shit started to hit the fan in 1920 when, a little after the First World War, Alfonso VIII, the King of France, went to war against Morocco to colonize it, which was vastly unpopular because the people wanted peace and rest. In 1931, the king left the country and Niceto Alcala Zamora declared the Second Republic government in the country amid the governmental vacuum. A lot of promises were made, among which were the independence of Catalonia, the northeastern autonomous community of Spain. The Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, which will be referred to as CNT to save me from the embarrassment of attempting to speak Spanish again, retaliated in 1934 after seeing that the government formed in 1931 did not deliver on the promises made of separation of Catalonia and progressive labor reforms, and the 1933 elections were won by political interests that wanted the territory and was reversing a lot of the labor-friendly laws as well. Amidst the chaos, Francisco Franco, a general with an experienced army, funded by the new government, crushed the rebellion and pissed off the communists, anarchists, and socialists in the area, who declared war against the government, given a reaction. A bunch of political murders later, all monarchists, traditionalists, nationalists, and fascists find themselves at war with a bunch we mentioned earlier. The war instantly became a proxy war for fascists and communists, where the Franco's army became the proxy for Nazi Germany and Italy, and the Republican army for the USSR. While this was going on, workers in Catalonia, Aragon, Andalusia, and some parts of Valencia, or surrounding Valencia, I'm not entirely certain of the detail, installed an organizational revolution where factories, farms, accommodations, educational and medicinal services were arranged on horizontal decentralized power structures, and for a charming moment, that worked. It was organized by CNT in collaboration with Federación Anarquista Ibérica, which I will refer to as FAI for the same reason of not making me speak Spanish again. It is worth mentioning that as early as 1935, the CNT FAI coalition was fighting their communist allies in most of the country, which is why Catalonia became the stronghold that is sung about in anarchist circles to this day. Chomsky's claims about the CNT FAI's organizational skills make the syndicate work came from an admittedly romanticized record provided by George Orwell himself in a book called Homage to Catalonia, where he claimed to see dissolved hierarchies and redistributed wealth to actually lead to less conflict than productive output. As one would guess, group of people resisting government with no governmental institution was an instant target for both dominating sides, backed by strong outside forces. And the anarchist forces were eventually pinched out by the communists and then eradicated completely by the nationalist forces united eventually giving the war in the hands of the fascists. The Spanish Civil War ended in 1939 as the World War began in 1939. The unfortunate truth about this bracket of European history is that it is severely underreported, at least to me, and even the sources I could find were at least sympathetic to the anarchist attempt. But given the 20th century outcome, the CNT-FAI's efforts for a brief 5 years of the Spanish Civil War is the closest we've seen rebellion come to staying away from messianism in its assertion of autonomy. The reason I say that is simple. There's no institutional wreckage from the effort in this war. It does not reduce on the violence because it was an experiment that came up only during a civil war of dramatic proportions, but was romanticized thoroughly by the man who understood messianism well enough to write two of the best books about authoritarianism. And one of them about the exact problem we're dealing with right now. We just discussed it minutes ago. Animal Farm. And if you haven't read Animal Farm, I couldn't urge you to read it even more. It lets you a perspective on what we're talking about immediately very well. Actually, this entire episode could be just a literary review for Animal Farm with historical context. The other example of messianism in revolutions not completely pooping the party is that of the Indian struggle for independence for me. I know I've had my quota of irrational and bold claims I may be fighting if anyone makes it this far into the episode for the month, but I couldn't help myself without this last bit. The Indian freedom struggle is in surprising ways more nuanced than most things that the Indian state ever managed to accomplish. The controversy here, of course, is that the Indian freedom struggle is by no means an achievement of the Indian people by themselves. We know that Article 3 of the Atlantic Charter of 1941 that brought America to fight in Europe read that they respect the right of all people. By they, it refers to, both UK and USA signatories to the Atlantic Charter. They respect the right of all people to choose the forms of governments under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-governance restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Meaning, the British Empire left their spice rack only because their extremely powerful friends insisted that they do. I should also mention that besides the Atlantic Charter, historians also claim that the money lost at war was also one of the reasons why the British Raj ended. But in an odd twist, the Indian struggle for independence is a unique twist not only on rebellion in assertion of self-governance and self-determination, but also on rebellion against messianism itself. And to be honest, same can be said about a lot of the decolonization movements across the globe. One of the justifications that the British Parliament floated at the time, and a piece of propaganda that still holds belief in some circles of the world today, is that the British were civilizing the indigenous people of India, and it was the white man's burden to civilize the brutes in the backward country like ours. I don't think I need to explain in excruciating detail how artificial famines, crippling heirlooms of businesses, and taxation to last the entire First World War is exactly an exercise in civilizing a group of people, or the racism inherent in the notion, but I do insist in recognizing the messianism at work here. Whether or not the British royal authorities and parliamentarians believed this lie, a fair number of officers posted in the country did, and believed that the Queen's subject till 1947 needed to be civilized. And I would argue that the Indian freedom struggle, due to its lack of violence and organized display of civil disobedience that looked great on camera, sounded great on radio, gained attention and achieved in views of someone in power of, if not the oppressor themselves, that we are their equal. While we are seriously short on cash as compared to the people who are claiming to be equals of even today, we are their equal in a smaller scale. For example, we have huge income disparities. Taxes still cause most of the protests. Our democratic structures and institutions are being used against us so that we're tired and slowed down and we're just trying to survive. So it's not that different. What I mean to say is that if democracy work better, life better. It's sorry to be controversial. Bold statements only on this channel. But getting back to our topic of discussion, which is rebellion, I think a good place to start as to where you start rebelling, because I know that every person in their own way, their own capacity, and for the causes that they believe in are a little rebellious to somebody. I don't support all of you, of course. I'm sorry. I disagree with quite a few of you actually. And of course, given how the power dynamics in this world are arranged, some of you have a better position to be rebellious than others, mostly by just the predisposition of who you were by your, let's call it, circumstance of existence. But the most important thing I've learned throughout the making of this episode about rebellion is that it's a very simple process of questioning why. While rebellion is technically assertion of your individuality against society that disagrees with it, your contrast of individuality never finds itself if it is never formed in reason, or at least an assumption of a reasonable man of what reason is. A semblance of reason, if you will. Other than that, I know being alive is pretty cringe, and you will learn over time what amount of rebellion that you engage in or rebellious activity you engage in is in the name of a higher cause, assertion of individuality, attention. And to be honest, if I'm speaking from personal experience, if you and I have literally anything in common in terms of thinking about this issue, I know that you already have or in the future will engage in what is deemed as rebellious behavior only to sort of disagree because you're bored. But I feel like you might correct your praxis and sort of go off on a way that's slightly better and more impactful than I have ever been on, because hopefully none of us will stop questioning why and engage in any activity or action without understanding why. There is actually an entire section about rebellion and art that we have not covered yet in this episode, which we were supposed to. At least I had written it down and I had to edit all of it out because I know it will fit somewhere else. And another announcement, sort of, that I'm making is that this is part of a series about autonomy. Unless I change my mind last minute and like don't go through doing 12 episodes about autonomy. But as of now, that's the plan. The plan is that the next 11 episodes that you will hear will be about the concept of autonomy, like a sub concept within the concept of autonomy. So read it with that lens. And if you like the content that you just heard, please help us create it by supporting me on Patreon. Another way of helping the podcast is, of course, by buying the merch, which is through an Instagram post in the description. And if money is not how you want to or can help out, that's okay. I get that. Just subscribe to the YouTube channel. Please leave a like on this video. Leave a like on every video that you hear and actually liked. And keep listening to us on Spotify. Me. It's just me. It's not us. It's just me. Keep listening to me on Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And take care of that fine booty. I meant yours. Bye.